Jason Blazakis has written a piece for the Sufan Intelligence Group on QAnon, and he joins me now from California. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing well, Dana. It's good to be here on your show.
The Q and the Anon, meaning the Anon is anonymous, and who the heck is a Q?
Yeah, it's a great question. Even the people who call themselves Anons, or are essentially followers of Q, don't really know. There's a lot of speculation ranging from President Donald J. Trump could be Q, John F.K. Kennedy Jr. Didn't really die in a plane accident. He could be Q. Q could be a guy in the government with a military intelligence background with a Q security clearance, which means when you have Q clearance in the government, you have nuclear access secrets. It could be any number of individuals, who could be Q. I have my own theory, which hasn't really been written about, and I may write something on it later, is that it's part of a large disinformation campaign organized by a state to stir up trouble. And the way that Q communicates certainly has led to a lot of individuals becoming adherents to this movement.
A state.
I have some concern that it could be part of a state disinformation effort. And if you look at the timing of the creation of Q, Q was created in essentially the first QAnon post was in 2017, not that long after President Trump's election, less than a year after it. And the focus of Q is to ensure that President Trump stays in power as he does battle against a deep state network of individuals who are trying to usurp his power. And
you're going to tell me it's another Russia conspiracy?
I wouldn't go there yet, but I do have some concerns that at a minimum, there are states like Russia who may be amplifying the messages of individuals who feel that they are QAnon followers or adherents, making it look like it's a movement larger than it really is. But one thing I hope to do, and I wear many hats, I work at the Sufan Center, as you introduced me, Dana, as a research fellow, but I also am a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, is we're going to start studying the syntax of the messages related to QAnon. When QAnon posts a new message, it's called a Q drop. Generally, in the past, he has posted in various freedom boards like 4chan, 8chan, 8kun, and then study sort of the transition in terms of language, how it's evolved, to get any kind of insights as to whether or not the syntax could be traced back linguistically, perhaps to another country. Maybe this is an individual that's publishing and writing that is not really using English or does not have English as a first language. So this is one hypothesis I have that I'm really interested in exploring here.
Why, Jason, are you taking your time, because you're a serious analyst, to write about this group? And why am I taking my time, because I think I'm a serious correspondent, to broadcast something about them? I mean, they have suddenly been held with serious regard by a lot of different agencies, including the FBI.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a little background about myself. I have been in the federal government for 20 years. I guess QAnon folks will automatically say whatever I have to say is null and void because of significant trust they have with individuals who worked in the federal bureaucracy.
You're another one of the deep state.
Yeah, they could proceed.
What they would say. All right.
Yeah, and I left the deep state, so maybe that like makes me a little bit better than those who remained in, right? But I worked in the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department, studying terrorists, whether it's ISIS, Al Qaeda, understanding who the individuals are within these networks, so the U.S. government could sanction them. And to sanction an individual or organization, you have to study them deeply. So I've always been interested in extremist movements. 10 and a half years, I was following counterterrorism related issues, primarily focusing on Salafi jihadist groups. But in 2016, the British government actually made a decision to designate a white supremacist group called National Action. And it was from that point forward, I started looking at the radical right milieu in which QAnon certainly sits. I've become more interested in QAnon, given that background. more recently over the last couple years because it's attracted a very wide following. It's exploded, unfortunately, via social media, and it has inspired individuals to carry out acts of violence. The most known one was the situation in New York where an individual killed a mafia boss because he felt that he needed to do justice by carrying out that attack against the mafia boss. You had a situation in the Hoover Dam area in Arizona where a QAnon follower parked his vehicle and blocked the bridge, and he was armed. And then you had the more recent incident showing that QAnon has gone overseas, where you had an individual who was consuming QAnon content. And people could argue, other experts say, well, he wasn't that actively involved in QAnon. He only had a few posts. But that individual carried out a ramming attack against the Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau's house in Rideau. And thankfully, he was stopped. He couldn't do harm. He was well armed. But 30 minutes before he actually did that attack, where he worked on Instagram, he reposted one of the conspiracy theories that QAnon has put forward before, talking about so-called Event 201, talking about a pandemic, talking about COVID, and how all this is being created by essentially a deep state with Bill Gates in cahoots, right? So for me, I'm
running to blink my eyes faster and faster, Jason, as we get lost in the mud here with this. But I mean, they're pretty incredible events. And then there was one with Pizzagate, right? Which is one of the highest profile one.
Absolutely. So Pizzagate predated QAnon, but a lot of people point to Pizzagate as being sort of the father of the QAnon conspiracy. And Pizzagate's really important to understand in the context of QAnon, because what QAnon is about as a conspiracy theory directly relates to the Pizzagate conspiracy. So you had an individual who was within the Hillary Clinton campaign who had essentially his emails hacked. His emails were published on WikiLeaks in 2016. And in those emails, he's talking to the owner of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria called Comet Ping Pong. And in those exchanges, there are discussions between the proprietor of Comet Ping Pong Pizza and the campaign individual Podesta within the Clinton campaign. And they're talking about pizza, they're talking about toppings, and there are conspiracy theorists who looked and examined this language and felt that somehow that's code words for children who are being exploited by adults. Essentially,
they believed that Hillary Clinton was deep involved and Democrats were deep involved in holding children hostage and pedophiles and the assaults and that allegedly this man came to believe that was taking place in the basement of the pizza store.
Correct. So the final thinking was essentially is in Comet Ping Pong Pizza, there's a basement where children are being held. They're part of a, being captive, part of a pedophilia ring run by people like Hillary Clinton and Podesta. And this man from North Carolina was reading all this online, and all this was being discussed online, and it felt he had taken it upon himself morally to do something about that. So he traveled from North Carolina to Washington, D.C., armed with an AR-15, started shooting, went downstairs to the basement, and didn't see any children. There were no children there. It was clearly false information.
And then he put down his weapon, as I understand it, kind of with the revelation of, oh gosh, this actually isn't taking place, right? But
exactly.
I mean, the fact is that people like that on the internet come to believe some of these wild conspiracy things from QAnon.
Oh, absolutely. People read this, not just individuals who are associated with Pizzagate, which predated QAnon, but afterwards you had individuals who actually have taken action. And this is part of the reason why the FBI in 2019, the Phoenix field office deemed QAnon to be a domestic terrorism threat. And I think for good reason, because individuals, particularly during a pandemic, when people are trapped at home, they're reading information online about all these conspiracies, they feel helpless. And if they have some kind of secret understanding which maybe these conspiracies give them, that they have some kind of secret understanding about this like conspiracy that's happening by the deep state. They could do something about it because they now are empowered and they can take power back from these global who are running the world.
And just to be clear, QAnon says there isn't really a pandemic. It's a well, I shouldn't say that. They say it's a conspiracy created by the left, by the Democrats against President Trump.
So you have individuals, most certainly, based on my research, a preponderance of individuals who are adherents or say that they believe QAnon guidance, that believe that there is a pandemic. There was even a movie made by QAnon followers called Plandemic that said this was a stage by the New World Order and people like George Soros to essentially take power and to eliminate enemies. But in terms of the actual QAnon, the individual who posts Q drops, as they're called, essentially posts on the various boards, these are
kind of like little coded messages, right?
Yeah, coded messages that QAnon adherents decode. He said that COVID-19 was real, but it was a good thing. Be prepared for it. And I think the thinking behind that, as many decoders believe, is that be the genesis for the beginning of what QAnon calls the Great Awakening.
All right. How many people are going to get this Great Awakening? Are we talking about a few dozen people on the internet, or do you think it's? And I know it's impossible to tell, but take a guess. Yeah. Is it in the tens of thousands, or is it?
I think we're at least in the tens of thousands. Now, there's individuals who are essentially what they call it, like red pilled, people who have seen the light. They see that there is first and foremost a deep state that exists that is trying to work as a secret cabal to usurp the President Trump, who is essentially the white knight of this movement. And on the second part of this thinking is that if this Great Awakening occurs, once you see and become enlightened, there's going to be a battle for the soul of America, and you have to do something about it. And
is that an armed battle?
Potentially an armed battle. I look at QAnon as a cult, and cults, particularly cults that believe in apocalyptical like thinking, things like a Great Awakening, where there could be a battle between good and evil, white hats versus black hats in the context of how QAnon describes them, white hats being essentially the QAnon followers within the government who are doing battle against the black hats who are Satanists and part of this deep state conspiracy. Whenever you think about the world in Manichaean terms like QAnon puts forward, there is this definite risk of turning to a violent apocalyptical like scenario. And if President Trump were to say lose, or it looks like he will lose, my fear is that you'd have QAnon adherents who may try to take matters in their own hands and carry out acts of violence to try to stop to make sure the Great Awakening occurs, or to stop those who are trying to stop the Great Awakening.
Because like the guy who went into the pizza store, they have been convinced, and they've been consuming this stuff. They'll believe that this wasn't a fair election, but in fact it was something done by the deep state, and they have got to stand up, maybe with weapons, and fight it.
Absolutely, and even Q's post on COVID-19, he said this is going to be used by the Democrats to create COVID-19, to create mass hysteria, and it's all with an eye towards the election. So Q himself is talking about COVID-19 in the context of the election, how Democrats could use it as essentially a bulwark against President Trump, and therefore making the election look illegal. And at the same time, you have the rhetoric of the president, of course, saying that the president poll numbers aren't as bad as they're saying, but if you have, say, mail-in voting, which would be a responsible thing to do during COVID-19, that somehow casts a dispersion upon the possible results of the election. So I think the president himself, unfortunately, has played in the hands of some of these QAnon followers by saying that the election itself is already perhaps not credible because of COVID-19 and because of the ideas behind mail-in voting, which he said will lead to fraud. And if there's fraud related to the election, then President Trump loses because of fraud. That's going to be very upsetting to QAnon followers.
So Jason, does the president unknowingly, unwittingly play to QAnon followers, or do you think that he is aware of QAnon and actually drops some things that may benefit him in with certain electorate.
Well, I'll tell you, QAnon thinks the president is messaging secretly to them. I have no evidence that the president believes that he's somehow secretly messaging to QAnon. But
I guess there were a couple of tweets, right? One was
Oh, he had over 100.
quarantine. The other one used something about his friends
Yeah.
in the UK, his support of the UK and the Queen, and people saw that in QAnon as a coded drop.
Oh, absolutely. The QAnon people see how he used quarantine and how he made a hand gesture that looked like a Q. But he has indeed retweeted QAnon followers over 100 plus times. I think last I read through media was maybe up to 145 times. Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump have tweeted and retweeted memes and other QAnon follower rhetoric before. So I think they're not doing it because necessarily they're QAnon followers or believe in Q. I think they're not just being careful with their social media feeds. And then QAnon followers, being the conspiracy theorists they are, read something into it, like the president is signaling something special to us.
So just to understand that, though, that sounds pretty sinister to me. They have retweeted tweets from QAnon followers.
And President Trump has done it over 100 times. Not QAnon himself, but QAnon followers, adherents, people on social media who believe in Q. And the president has retweeted them. So he probably doesn't know that he's retweeting QAnon followers. I don't think he's being necessarily careful about what he retweets. Clearly, he has a capacity to retweet many things, later of which he has removed or deleted his own tweets, or his campaign team or the White House have disassociated from those tweets, or they've said that that's not really what he was meaning. So I don't think it's intentional on purpose by the president. I think it's unintentional. But the problem is, because he's not careful about what he says over social media, it is really riling up these individuals who are QAnon followers and then believe essentially and bolsters the theories that somehow President Trump is perhaps Q himself, or trying to motivate QAnon people to support him in some fashion. And there is a political element to this too, beyond the Trumps. There are, last count, there was a journalist who said that there was more than 66 QAnon followers running for various state and federal offices. So you have this normalization that's occurring with QAnon as well, and that makes it really dangerous.
How many?
More than 60.
I mean, I'm shocked by that. And I was reading in The Atlantic, and by the way, they didn't call it a cult, they call it a new religion.
They call it a religion. Yeah, and there's religious overtones to it. Absolutely. They take a lot of imagery
at least
and they adopt it.
At least 35 current or former congressional candidates have embraced Q, according to an online tally by the nonprofit Media Matters.
Yeah, and I think that same journalist who has continued to study this has put it at 66, and there's another 30 plus who are running for office right now. Some may have lost already, but people who are running to become members of Congress. And I think there was one member, potentially one individual that may get elected out of Georgia, if memory serves. I forget her name off the top of my head. But you may actually end with a scenario where you have a QAnon follower in Congress. And that's the danger of this movement, that it somehow becomes more normalized. A lot of people call it a fringe movement, but slowly you have more and more people reading, consuming, watching videos like Plandemic, who actually believe what's being written, and then may become followers themselves, or somehow by virtue of passing along this video to other people in their Facebook group, it becomes more of a normal thing. And that's really dangerous during a pandemic.
You're taking it very seriously.
Oh, absolutely. There are people who are trapped, like I said, we're living in uncertain times. When you feel uncertain, you feel powerless. Conspiracy theories have resonance in ways in which can motivate individuals to join the movement, or at worst, become an entity or individual who carries out violence on behalf of a movement because of something they saw online. Pedophilia is a terrible thing. And if people actually believe some of the things going on, like the most recent conspiracy theory put forward by QAnon, that somehow Wayfair, the furniture company, was selling essentially material for really high prices, $13,000 for a stack of cabinets. People are saying, well, that's some part of a ring of children being sold by Wayfair, which was completely wrong. But it took off on social media and had an impact on Wayfair, and they had to respond. So you see this danger. If you actually think a child's in danger, you want to do something about it. And if you believe that conspiracy, you may actually do something about it. And there is no there. And that's the challenge with QAnon and the threat it poses.
So,
yeah, please go ahead, Dana.
It's spread like wildfire through the internet over several years now, right? So now you have from Reddit to Facebook to Twitter. Twitter now has taken down some 7,000 accounts linked to QAnon. Do you think that that's a good idea? Is it going to do anything, or is this just sort of closing the barn door after the horse is bolted?
I think, unfortunately, it's more of the latter, but I will say it was a good decision to take down inauthentic Twitter accounts and handles associated with the QAnon movement. And I think in addition to taking down those 7,000 and removing them outright, probably I think I read 150,000 were limited in some way as well.
Yes.
That's a positive action. Reddit was the first out there in 2018 to take action against QAnon, particularly those that were putting out conspiracies on the subreddit board known as R Conspiracy Board. And then you have YouTube, actually. I noticed about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and this could be happening much longer than that, but QAnon videos now have underneath of them a box that says, like, this is a far-right conspiracy, which it is. And it's good they have that fact-checking box. And then I think we probably both read that Facebook may be taking a decision soon to remove QAnon-related groups as well. QAnon is all over Facebook, private groups and public groups. In the context, from my perspective, these are good decisions because these are mainstream social media platforms that touch so many more people than, say, 4chan, 8chan, or 8Q ever have. So you're, I think, inherently making their reach less impactful by taking those actions. My fear is, though, it's a little too late, and they may migrate to another service, and the conspiracy will continue on. And particularly problematic is the fact that they may have a member of Congress or people in state assemblies in the United States who are politicians who could be advocating things from a policy perspective that are inherently problematic. So I think, again, barn door was closed after horse left, like you said, Dana.
Well, I mean, that's always been the intelligence debate with counterterrorism. Do you allow these things to kind of bubble at the surface so that you can monitor them, or do you pull them off and push these people underground, and it makes it much more difficult to get after some of the more extremists that may be contemplating violence?
Yeah, now that is the dilemma. You remove them from open source platforms in which you could observe them, and they go to encrypted communications in which they're more difficult to track. That is the dilemma. From my perspective, I'd rather have fewer individuals as part of a movement and have a more difficult time monitoring them. You still can go into those encrypted apps. You can break the encryption. You can insert an individual who pretends to be part of a group and gets vetted online and can still infiltrate that encrypted network, right? In that chat group, or if it's Telegram, that join that Telegram group. So there are still law enforcement tools, time honored, that can infiltrate in groups that are more secretive in nature. From my perspective, I'd rather just have fewer recruits and members and adherents. And I think that's why I think the actions taken by Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Silicon Valley writ large, like Reddit's action in 2018, is very important because it can limit the number of individuals who are consuming this information. I just want to also add, TikTok has unfortunately become another avenue in which the Pizzagate conspiracy, which a lot of people thought was dead in 2016, had a second life because it took off on TikTok again. And then TikTok actually made a decision to, I think, remove the hashtag Pizzagate remove some of the other QAnon hashtags. And that's really important because TikTok is now sort of the viral social media platform. And it seems like they're taking early action against that proliferation over their platform, which is a good thing.
Jason Blazakis with the Soufan Center, mind-blowing stuff and really intriguing. And thank you so much for taking the time to kind of lay this out for me.
No, my pleasure, Dana. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be with your listeners.